Hoosier State, Mr. Rudy Yakum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today, and thank you to Director Swagel for being here to testify on CBO's baseline projections. As we've previously discussed, the CBO plays a critical and vital role in providing Congress with objective and nonpartisan data to help us as legislators make the most informed decisions possible. CBO's baseline is important to understanding our nation's current economic and fiscal state, as well as helping this committee put together our annual budget resolution. This year's baseline does show some concerning figures about the fiscal state of our nation. Our nation currently sits at $34.2 trillion of debt, or 122% of GDP. And over the next decade, the CBO projects this figure to grow to $54.4 trillion, or 130% of our GDP. Additionally, this year's baseline shows multiple government trust funds going insolvent over the next decade. For example, the CBO projects that the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, which funds the majority of Social Security, will become insolvent by 2033, which would result in an automatic 25% cut for Social Security recipients. Let me state that again. If we do nothing, we will have an automatic 25% cut for Social Security recipients. You also project that the Highway Trust Fund will be exhausted by 2028. And these figures are very deeply concerning to me. While we cannot allow our debt and deficit to continue on this unsustainable and irresponsible path, we in the House must do something about it. So my first question for you would be, it's something that I'm very deeply concerned about is the rising cost of our national debt. Your report projects our annual interest payments to rise to $870 billion in 2024, which is a $211 billion increase from last year. How do our rising interest payments impact our long-term debt trajectory? Director Swagel.
These net interest payments, in some sense, are going to overwhelm all the other possible uses of our budget, right? We have the mandatory spending that continues on autopilot, and then discretionary spending will get overwhelmed or crowded out by the rising interest payments.
And so what are some of the fiscal and or particularly the economic implications? If you could just go there, talk about the economic implications tied to our growing interest payments.
Right, and that is, to me, that's the real long-term concern, is that the rising interest payments, the rising deficits and debt will feed back into yet higher interest rates and have other negative economic consequences: lower investment, lower job creation, lower growth, excuse me, less ability for us to face up to our economic and other challenges.
Yeah, in this, to that point, in this House, and obviously we need to restore fiscal responsibility. We talk a lot and almost exclusively in the House about the need to cut discretionary spending. In your estimates, I mean, the numbers are very plain and very simple. Can we rein in our debt and deficit with only changes to discretionary spending?
No, it's just not possible. Eventually, we have to look at other things.
Other things being?
Either mandatory spending or revenues.
Yeah, thank you. How does the CBO baseline account for the potential impact of regulatory policies?
We do in part. So we do our best to look at the regulatory policies that have been enacted, incorporated or put in place by the administration or proposed, and look at what's the economic impact and the fiscal impact. We're not able to detail each and every regulation, but we get some of the major ones. And
can you talk about how the regulatory costs under this administration, under the Biden administration, how it compares to the last administration? Has it increased, has the Biden administration's regulatory actions that they've taken increased or decreased the fiscal outlook, or I should say maybe the total projected debt over the next decade?
It's a really good question. I can't compare against the last administration. I just don't have that off the top of my head. I'm not sure we've even done that. But some of the major regulations show up in our budgetary projections, and the EPA and student loans and others.
And then briefly, last spring, we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, or the FRA, which imposed caps on discretionary spending for fiscal years 24 and 25. How did those spending caps impact our overall federal deficit, projected deficit over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so those caps and then the CRs that put them into practice were the largest impact in reducing our deficit trajectory. And that in total, that was about $2.6 trillion over 10 years.
All right. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana. We have 10 members, all on the Republican side, so we're just going to continue to roll through this. But I appreciate my Republican colleagues being here for this important conversation. So, Mr. Moore from Utah, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Director, thank you for being here. Look, the CBO's updated baseline shows that House Republicans, and in order to do this, we had to win the majority back, and we did that. And we've taken that opportunity and been effective at forcing the Biden administration to agree to lower federal spending. Unprecedented levels from 21 and to the 2021 and 2022, winning back that majority, we were able to put a clamp on that. That's a positive. CBO is now projecting that the federal government will spend nearly 10% less on discretionary spending over the next decade, largely due to the Fiscal Responsibility Act that was passed last summer. That's significant, and that's a significant conservative win that we were able to lower that and trim that out of the budget for the next little while. But while it's a great step, the updated baseline also demonstrates that we have a lot more work to do. Within the next 10 years, nearly 80% of federal spending will be on mandatory spending, and our annual appropriations process will only consider a shortening and a lessening 20% of what our federal government spends each year. My legislation, the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act, which I introduced with my colleague from Washington State, Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, would reform our budget process to better empower members to make reforms to revenues, direct and discretionary spending each year. Instead of just ignoring $4.5 trillion of our $6 trillion budget, it would actually incorporate the entirety of it. It would do kind of like what states do and why states are able to keep their spending in a responsible trajectory, unlike us at the federal government. Dr. Swagel, a couple quick questions. This year, spending on interest costs that service the national debt will exceed the federal government's spending on Medicare and our national defense. By the end of the 10-year window, CBO projects our country will spend nearly $2 trillion annually on interest costs. What are the long-term implications of the U.S. growing interest cost?
It's a budgetary challenge and an economic challenge that rising interest costs will crowd out other possible uses of government resources and then also pose a risk to our economic stability, our financial stability, to high interest rates, to job creation, to economic growth.
Every constituent that comes into my office and they've got a program they care about and it matters and they show the data, how it's been effective, and I put a graph on there to talk to them about the interest costs and what it's doing to crowd out the things that we need to be able to address. Highest inflation we've had in 4 decades following inflationary policies. I look at the American Rescue Plan as a very, very rapid bill that happened really quick without much concern for what it would do to the inflationary pressure in the U.S. And of course the IRA, which is much more expensive than was projected. When President Biden took office, the projected yield on 10-year treasuries was 2.5% over the next decade. The updated baseline now, that number is 4.1%. This affects not only how much the federal government spends to service the national debt, but it also ripples throughout the economy. Can you speak to how increasing interest rates affect the economy writ large, particularly families and job creators?
Yes, I can. And you put your finger on it. Families, higher interest rates make it more expensive for families to spend, to do the things they want to do. And higher interest rates affect businesses that are looking to invest and create jobs. And both of those affect the economy and therefore the federal budget.
And the inflationary pressure in the nation right now, like with Republicans winning back the majority, we were able to put a clamp on trillions and trillions of dollars that President Biden he enacted and was continuing to push. And that simply controls our monetary policy. And our monetary policy now more under control than it has been in the last couple of years. We're seeing inflation slow down. Prices are unfortunately here to stay because of what we went through those couple of years. But we are doing our part to put a clamp on that. Last question. The CBO's recent baseline suggests that Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund will be solvent throughout the 10-year budget window. In the Medicare trustees' most recent report last March, they project the HI trust will become insolvent in 2031, resulting in an automatic across-the-board cut for seniors. What factors account for the difference between CBO and the trustees' estimate? They're different. CBO, it's solvent through the 10-year cycle, but the trustees has it at 2031. What factors are different? Why can't we get a consistent number here?
Okay, no, it's an important question. We have somewhat different modeling approaches, but we also have different economic projections. Ours is more recent, so we probably have more of the higher inflation, which is a negative for families, but means more more tax revenue coming into Medicare because we tax a nominal base, and so I suspect that's part of it. Is that we have a slightly better revenue path than they do, maybe a better lower spending path. We both see the system as facing severe challenges. It's just a matter
Whether it's a couple of years or whatnot, it's still facing
That's
major
the big
challenges. When will the trustee address updated numbers?
Sometime
You
this
had- you know-
spring. Sometime this spring they will put out an update.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Director.
I think the gentleman from Utah, our deputy chair of the Republican Conference, which makes him the likely next candidate for Speaker of the House. With that, I yield 5 minutes to Dan Kildee from the great state of Michigan.
I thought you liked the gentleman from Utah.
Just,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you and the ranking member for holding this meeting. Mr. Schwegel, good to see you again. I promise no references to professional wrestling, and I just made one. One aspect of the CBO baseline that I'd like to touch on is the projected tax revenues over the next decade. Obviously, we know Americans deserve a government that's fiscally responsible and is working to lower our national debt, but reducing our deficit means looking at the entirety of the budget, not just cutting those programs that are important to families, to seniors, and to kids, but also having a tax code that's fair, one that does not allow the wealthiest individuals and the largest corporation in this country to avoid paying anything close to their fair share in taxes. Our tax code should not let Fortune 500 companies get away with paying less in federal taxes than a teacher in Bay City, Michigan, for example, or a nurse in Saginaw, or a factory worker in Midland. So let's just quickly review the facts. Under President Trump, Republicans added $8 trillion to the national debt, including nearly $2 trillion alone from the Trump tax scam. That gave overwhelming benefits to the wealthiest millionaires and billionaires in America. And now we see a desire to extend those tax giveaways to the super wealthy. So, Mr. Schwegel, the CBO issued a report last May, and I know Mr. Doggett addressed this, but I wonder if you might be specific on this if you could. The CBO report last May dealt with this issue. How much would according to your report, how much would extending the Trump tax cuts for the wealthy add to our national deficit?
After 2025, when many of the provisions expire, extending all of the expiring provisions would run about $300 billion a year.
But just to be clear, when you aggregate that, the May 2023 report found that extending the Trump tax cuts to the wealthy Americans, large corporations, would add $3.5 trillion to the national deficit. That's what the report indicated, correct?
In total over time.
3.5 trillion, thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the nonpartisan CBO office May 2023 report that found extending the Trump tax cuts would add 3.5 trillion to the deficit through 2033.
without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Also, under Democratic leadership, for me anyway, one of the proudest achievements was capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month out of pocket for our seniors. Democrats and President Biden got that done. And unfortunately, Republicans opposed that legislation. Under this new law, we also gave Medicare the power to negotiate directly with big pharmaceutical companies to stop them from charging our seniors and others outrageous prices for the medications that they rely on. On February 1, the Biden administration took the very important step in implementing this new program, sending companies that make 10 of the most expensive drugs initial offers to kick off the negotiating process. And I wonder, Director Swigel, if you might let us know how much drug price negotiation program established under the Inflation Reduction Act would reduce our national deficit and save the American people over the next 10 years?
So our estimate was that the drug price negotiation you're focusing on would lower the deficit by just under $100 billion over the 10-year period. It's $98.5 billion of deficit reduction.
Okay, so just for the record, I appreciate that. The proposal to extend the Trump tax cuts would add $3.5 trillion to the deficit. And the Democrats in the Biden administration approach to drug price negotiation would save $100 billion. I got that right?
I think you've got the numbers.
Actually, you've got it right, because those are your numbers. I appreciate it very much. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan. Now yield 5 minutes to our friend from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr.
Chuck
Chairman.
Edwards.
Thanks, Mr. Swagel, for being with us again this afternoon. You testified just a few minutes ago that the CBO baseline had declined by, I believe it was $2.3 trillion as a result of the Fiscal Responsibility Act and the Further Continuing Appropriations and Other Extensions Act. Yeah. Which of those acts accounted for how much of that reduction in baseline spending?
So in a sense, it's the sum of all of those, because the Fiscal Responsibility Act put in place the caps, and then the continuing resolutions, in some sense, implemented those caps over the sort of extent, the subsequent periods. And so that's why it's the combination of all those things together where the 2.3 trillion, as you said, was the savings just from the FRA and the continuing resolutions.
So 2.3 trillion is not nearly enough, but it seems like a pretty good start. I'm just curious, when in America's history have we reversed that baseline by as much as 2.3 trillion?
It's certainly not in my time as director. This is my 5th year. And that was why we highlighted it. It was a noteworthy improvement in the fiscal trajectory. I can't think of the last time. Maybe, I just don't know. I'd have to go back and look at past baseline.
Do you think there has been a time in American history when we changed the baseline by that significant amount?
I mean, the baseline would change with changes in the economy, with changes in legislation. CBO's had trouble predicting recessions. And so when a recession hits or a financial crisis hits, the baseline changes typically for the worse. So it could be that's been the case. And I just don't know those past baselines.
One of the other things that really caught my attention in your report, really because of the political noise that I keep hearing about, the economy is just booming, everything's going well. But when I look at the collection of individual income taxes, I see a sharp decline between 2022 and 2023. And you cite that the biggest part of that is because of a decline in capital gains. I'm having a tough time reconciling a great economy and such a reduction in individual income tax because of capital gains. Can you help me understand the truth between the two of those?
I can, and it's a challenge for us in projecting revenues because families get to decide when to realize their capital gains and pay taxes on them. So we can see the stock market going up or going down and know that affects capital gains, but the relationship between the realizations and therefore the revenues is indirect because it depends on family behavior. We had extraordinarily high capital gains in 22, and then we said, look, they're going to come down in 23. It looks like they came down much more than we expected, and that's one of the challenges that we face in thinking about what's our revenue projections in the future.
Do you see, or how do you see the collection of income tax on capital gains being an indicator of the condition of the economy?
It's an indicator in part that the changes in the equity market, the very strong equity market we had in 21 coming out of the pandemic, said something about people's expectations of the economy, but by far it's not the only indicator. of the strength of the economy. But there is a relationship.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank the gentleman from North Carolina. You have 5 minutes to our friend from Oklahoma, Josh Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, I thought all my Democrat colleagues had just slipped on out the back door with all these very strong lines of questions over here on the Republican side. Jimmy Panetta, our friend from California. I apologize, Mr. Burkeen. 5 minutes. I should give you as much time as you may consume, but I will not do that.
There you go.
In the interest of time. Jimmy, take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh, sorry about that. Director Swagel, good to see you again, and thanks for coming back. As always, I'm sure you'd like to see less of us, but we're glad that you're always willing to testify before the Budget Committee, and given your expertise and the CBO's very, very good work and diligent work. Obviously, the CBO's recent report on our debt and deficits, I guess you would say, is both troubling and informative at the same time. It really gives us a better understanding of the key drivers of debt and how it is predictable and predicted, to grow in the near and long term. It also gives us some hope, though, that as the deficit in fiscal year 2024 is decreasing when compared to fiscal year 2023. And so at this hearing, we got an opportunity to at least examine the report and take a good look at what is working and what needs to be addressed. And we can ask what we can do to increase revenues with or without increasing taxes, and we can reduce spending with or without making cuts to programs. But I guess first and foremost, let me just kind of say it, especially in light of some recent votes that this committee has taken. What are the odds that if we simply do nothing, economic conditions might change to a degree that deficits start to close on their own?
Stronger growth would help, but it's not plausible for us to have enough stronger growth to close the deficit on its own.
So we have to do something.
We have to do something.
And your projections for our Social Security trust funds are based on current law, which, again, I would say is doing nothing. What are the odds that without any policy changes, demographic shifts address our trust fund shortfalls?
Again, better demographics would help, more workers relative to retirees, but the gap in the trust funds is so large that it's just not plausible that, those sorts of changes by themselves would prevent the exhaustion of the trust funds.
Once again, something needs to be done.
Something needs to be done. I agree.
While prices are still high, our economy has been remarkably, as noted by many people throughout the world, I would say, our economy has been remarkably resilient, and inflation is coming down, I think, which we can all agree on based on the numbers, which could soon lead to interest rate cuts, as we're seeing. But what impact does strong economic growth have on our debt and deficits?
So more growth, stronger job creation means more income and more revenue. It also means lower outlays for some things, the means-tested benefits, lower unemployment insurance payments and things like that. So stronger growth helps on both the outlay side and the revenue side.
Now, as we've seen, the unemployment rate has continued to be at pretty much almost at record lows. And clearly, it would help if we had people to fill those jobs. And I think that is where immigration comes in. Why does increased immigration how does that help in reducing our debt deficit?
We have the surge of immigration from 22 to 2026, and our projections means a much larger labor force. And that means more workers, as you said, more income, and then more revenue, and that contributes to a lower deficit.
Now, clearly, obviously, we want legal, we want orderly immigration, but there's also policies that do that in regards to the H-2A program, or green card programs. Would those help in regards to reducing deficits?
The details would matter, but in general, a policy that increases the number of legal workers would tend to mean a stronger economy and lower deficits.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Swagel. I appreciate it. I yield.